The reason cannabis should have remained in Schedule 1 is that it's a smoked product, and that can't be a medicine. So this argument about descheduling, to me, should have started and ended there, and unfortunately, it did not.
Journalist Alex Berenson is a former New York Times reporter and author of Tell Your Children, The Truth About Marijuana, Mental Illness, and Violence.
There's a lot of scientific evidence that cannabis, especially when kids or young adults, when they use it in its current high potency form, can have really severe mental health impacts.
He raises concerns about links to behavior typically associated with cannabis use.
For whatever reason, in states that have legalized, they see a lot of high-speed car accidents with cannabis.
Berenson critiques America's overdependence on drugs and the long-term consequences of what he calls drugs of abuse.
Unfortunately, societally, sometimes we look for a quick fix. We, as a society, have to be honest with ourselves about what we are doing and what we are encouraging kids to do. And when we say don't stigmatize drug use, why wouldn't we want to stigmatize drug use? Why wouldn't we want to stigmatize THC use?
This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Yanya Kellick. Alex Berenson, such a pleasure to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Yeah, so good to be here.
So something remarkable happened the other day. President Trump signed an executive order moving marijuana from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. I don't think most people even understand the significance of this. Some people say it means nothing. Others say it's the, legalizing of marijuana. It's neither of those. What's the truth?
Well, the truth is that it's something that the industry really wanted, the cannabis industry, because it's going to increase their profits a lot. And you can tell this because in the days after the rumor that this was actually going to happen became public, the stocks of cannabis companies, big weed, as I sometimes call it, went way up. This will give the industry more access to the financial system, and it will increase the industry's profits by enabling to deduct some taxes. As a practical matter, that's really what it does. Okay, the President Trump said the other day, well, this will improve medical research and make it possible for more research on cannabis. That's very unlikely for a couple reasons. First of all, there has been a lot of research on the potential medical properties of cannabis and THC, which is the chemical in cannabis that gets people high, and a chemical called CBD, which does not get people high, but is also in cannabis. And unfortunately, for the most part, those studies, when they're done and done well, do not show much impact for cannabis on most of the things it's supposed to help, much less things like cancer. And if you actually think about it, that's totally reasonable, because why would we think one plant is some magic cure for everything? That's not how medicine works. It's not how our bodies work. It's not how science works. Cannabis and THC are really good at doing one thing, getting people high. That's what they're good at. And when they're tested, against other conditions, they generally don't work very well.
And do you mean like treating those conditions or the pain reduction around those conditions?
I mean both, actually. Okay. So this was surprising even to me. 7 years ago, I wrote a book called Tell Your Children. Tell Your Children, when it came out, was controversial. The core thesis, I'd say it's gotten less controversial over that time. But the core thesis of it was, look, there's a lot of scientific evidence that cannabis, especially when kids or young adults use it, and especially when they use it in its current high potency form, and they use a lot of it, can have really severe mental health impacts. And specifically, heavy use can cause a condition called psychosis. Psychosis is a break from reality. Literally people will wind up in the emergency room thinking, that their families are going to do terrible things to them, or that the cop who's driven by once in the last hour is actually out to get them, whatever it might be. And so I would say that when I wrote Tell Your Children, that thesis was debated in the scientific community. I think in the 7 years since, we've gotten even more evidence that it is correct, and I think even people who are in the industry would acknowledge that there's a risk. Okay, but to go back to your initial question, which was about pain and pain relief, I was very surprised to find that when cannabis and THC have been studied in placebo-controlled studies, meaning you test where you give one person THC and you give another person, just a pill that, or a pill that contains nothing, or they smoke a joint that actually has no THC in it. you don't find lasting effects of pain relief from cannabis. I think the reason for that is that what cannabis is really good at, what THC is really good at, is enhancing sensation. So people, they want to use it when they're having a meal, when they're listening to music, maybe if they're, having sex. Those things it can enhance the sensation of. But if you're in pain, in the long run, enhancing sensation actually is not a good thing for you. And so ultimately, when cannabis has been tested this way, doctors find that it doesn't have a very good lasting impact on pain. And there was a really good study a few years ago in Australia where people who'd used for a long period of time actually were used more opioids than people who didn't use cannabis. And so the idea that cannabis is a substitute or a way out of our opioid problem is just not true. And I really can't emphasize that enough because it's been sold this way to people. And I think President Trump, when I listened to his press conference the other day, I think there's part of him that means well about this. I mean, he doesn't use drugs. And I think he had a lot of people kind of yapping at him about this who do use cannabis and who like it and who want fewer restrictions on it. But ultimately, he made a mistake.
Correct me if I'm wrong here, but practically what this says is that marijuana is not as dangerous as something like heroin or these, methamphetamine, whatever, like these, again, Schedule 1 chemicals, and that it's opens up the door for a little more research potentially. That's kind of what
that's the way it's being framed.
Okay.
So here's what you need to know about Schedule 1. The reason a drug gets put in Schedule 1 actually is apart from its dangers, whether it has any medical use. So, for example, fentanyl is in Schedule 2, while heroin is in Schedule 1. Why is fentanyl in Schedule 2? Because fentanyl is actually used to treat severe pain. If you come out of a surgery where they've just, amputated your leg or whatever, you need fentanyl, okay? So it has a medical use. The reason cannabis should have remained in Schedule 1, and they could have, for example, done something that I don't know if legally could have, but a better move would have been to create something, let's call it Schedule 1R, to allow more research on cannabis. The reason cannabis should have remained in Schedule 1 is that it's a smoked product, okay? And that can't be a medicine. Tobacco, not a medicine. Even though there might be compounds in tobacco that are actually, improve brain function or whatever.
Right.
If you have to smoke it, it should be a Schedule 1. Now, THC, maybe you could say, okay, Schedule 2, Schedule 3. So this argument about descheduling, to me, should have started and ended there, and unfortunately, it did not. Now, am I going to tell you that cannabis is as dangerous as heroin or cocaine? Of course not. It's not nearly as dangerous as those things. The question is, and I think we really, as a society, have gotten, particularly in the United States, have gotten lost about this. Do we want to encourage or discourage drug use broadly? And I'm talking about alcohol. I'm talking about drugs that are sold illegally. I'm talking about drugs that are medically prescribed. And I think we have made a huge blunder in encouraging the use of drugs of abuse. Whether that could be something like Adderall. Okay, Adderall is a drug we give to kids, to children, and we say they have ADHD, which frankly is a condition that I think everyone in the world now has who has a phone, and we give them Adderall. What is Adderall? It's essentially amphetamine. Amphetamine is an addictive and dangerous drug, and we should not be encouraging doctors to prescribe that to children. We should, if what we believe about cannabis is, hey, it's not that dangerous, maybe, alcohol's legal, cannabis should be legal, then let's legalize it on that basis. I don't agree, but that would be an intellectually honest way to do this. What we did recently, what we did with the descheduling, is say this is medicine and we need to research it more. And to me, that's just further going down the road of confusing people about what this is.
Fascinating. I've had a number of people over the years on the show and discussing about how marijuana has changed over the last 30 years or so, okay? And specifically that they've been making much more concentrated variants, and that's often what's sold. So what 30 years ago might not have caused psychosis very often, if ever, today it's like a whole different game just because of the raw concentration. Can you frame that for me a little bit?
Sure, that's absolutely correct. Yeah. So 50 years ago, cannabis that that was in a joint that you smoked at Woodstock or whatever, that might have been 1 or 2% THC. So a few milligrams of cannabis in a joint. Okay. When I was growing up, in the 80s or in the 90s, it might have been 5% THC. Now, if you go into a dispensary, they're stores, okay, the bud tender will sell you a product that is 20 to 30% THC if it's flower cannabis. So 20 times as much THC in this one joint as there was. But that isn't even the real problem. The real problem is you can also, it's not even smoking, it's inhaling from a vape that might be 95% THC. This is not a plant at all. It's just a chemical to get you high. And so, look, 50 years ago, if you wanted to get enough THC into your body to really get high and potentially get psychotic, you just smoke a lot, okay? You had to use a bong, otherwise you're going to irritate your throat. You kind of had to smoke all day. Now you can walk around with this little device and inhale massive amounts of THC. And that really is a change that has made the product a lot more dangerous.
Okay, so this is interesting because on the one hand, so now these vape products, but that you would probably say, right, that's not really marijuana now. That's just, so that could actually be a Schedule 2 or Schedule 3, right? Because it's THC right. Mostly and not marijuana
I mean, so it could be a Schedule 3 or 2 to the extent that it has a medical use. So in other words, if we found that THC in its pure form actually, treated condition X or Y, we could approve it for that. I think it's fair to say that 99.99% of the cannabis consumed in the THC consumed in the United States is not for that condition. So this, again, is a little bit of a red herring. What I'm saying is that we, as a society, have to be honest with ourselves about what we are doing and what we are encouraging kids to do. And when we say don't stigmatize drug use, why wouldn't we want to stigmatize drug use? Why wouldn't we want to stigmatize THC use? And by the way, alcohol too. Okay, listen, I drink. Okay, but am I going to claim that alcohol can't be problematic for people? No, of course it can be. Should we have spirits advertising on television? I don't think so. I think that was a mistake. The First Amendment may require it. Maybe there's a way we can dial it back. But should we have higher taxes on alcohol? Sure. This is about all drugs and the way we think about them.
Alex, one quick sec. We're going to take a break. And folks, we're going to be right back. And we're back with Alex Berenson, author of the Unreported Truth Substack. You mentioned you were shocked to discover how little of a pain relief effect it really has in the studies. What are some other things that kind of shocked you in your research when it came to marijuana? That were surprising?
So I would say that there are two things that, beyond the sort of psychosis connection and this sort of increased link to schizophrenia, which is a terrible disease, a disease I would not wish on, my worst enemy. There's increasing evidence in the last 10 years that cannabis and THC, and this is not from smoking, this apparently is from the effect of the chemical itself, can cause really severe heart damage. There is a link to MIs, myocardial infarction, heart attacks. And that link that's pretty strong now. You can find papers that show a 3x increase over a multi-year period. And these are to young people, right? So they're very low baseline risk, but the risk is very real and increased. And then the other is, I think a lot of people think, oh, cannabis, if you're using and you're stoned, you're just going to drive very slowly and cautiously. For whatever reason, in states that have legalized, they see a lot of high-speed car accidents with cannabis. And whether that's because people are getting paranoid and just driving really fast, whether it's because it's just the intoxication effects, this idea that, when you get stoned, you just drive 10 miles an hour, and if anything, your problem is that you're not moving at all, turns out not to be true. So that one was a surprise for me also.
Fascinating. Okay. See, this is so interesting because, there's something people would describe as an overprescription crisis, right? Whether it's around mental health drugs or pain drugs or whatever, right? So those are the sort of the okay drugs, the ones we accept. And then there's the drugs of abuse, the ones that we don't accept. And in general, there's a lot of, I don't know how what you
except we do accept them. Okay, that's what I mean.
Yeah. Yeah. Right, except that we seem to be on the path to accepting.
Again, you can go to a doctor and get an Adderall prescription. No problem. There's been an amazing thing that's happened in this country in the last 5 years where the DEA has sort of tried to limit the amount of amphetamine that's legally produced. And so you get these spot shortage of amphetamine where, adults are driving around between pharmacies trying to get their prescription filled. I mean, what better proof is there that this is an addictive drug? But so, yeah, I mean, we are all over the map on this. And, again, what we did recently with cannabis, what the president did just makes it worse. I am calling for sort of like a broad rethinking of this. And I understand what you're saying, that you can think about this even more broadly and say, we have become too addicted to medicines as a crutch instead of trying to live our lives in healthier ways. Why aren't we stigmatizing drug use? Why aren't we stigmatizing, to some extent, risky sexual behavior is a little more complicated because, I mean, people are definitely going to have sex. And so you do want them, if they're going to have sex, to have it in a better way. And so there, I think there's a legitimate argument about like abstinence-based education versus, using condoms and being healthier. But with drug use is very culturally determined. Okay, and here's yet another example I think people don't think enough about. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, China had such a problem with opioids, with opium, that its society essentially collapsed. Well, there is essentially no opioid use in China now. And that tells me that there wasn't something inherent to the Chinese character or Chinese genetics that caused opium use to be a terrible problem. It was a cultural issue. And the culture has corrected. In the U.S., we've gone exactly the opposite way. So we can stigmatize and discourage behavior. That doesn't mean we're ever going to eliminate it. There's always going to be people who want to try drugs. But there's a large group of people in the middle who are persuadable, and we should be trying to persuade them.
What would be the process in your mind, given what we saw with COVID and the various failures of health policy? Some sort of pandemic arrives, whether it's from a lab or elsewhere, right?
We can both agree. I think we both agree COVID came out of a lab.
Yeah. What's the approach? Like, it seems to me the approach of looking for, drugs or approaches that have some sort of plausible method of action and seeing if they're helpful for whatever reason is probably a good idea.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I mean, and we should try to do that quickly. I mean, the British actually were good at that with COVID. I think the National Health Service actually got people into sort of randomized trials in a way that the U.S. system, which is more fragmented and more profit-driven, didn't do as good a job of. In part because, people, they were willing to try repurposed, off-label drugs. The ivermectin backers are certainly correct that, drug companies are not interested in helping find cheap drugs and get them to market. That I can't dispute. So, I mean, look, I think there's a bigger question about COVID, which is for 20 years before COVID, we had a plan. And the plan was, if this is a respiratory virus with a lethality of, let's say, 1%, which COVID did not have, by the way, we're going to treat it as a medical problem, okay? And yes, that could be a lot of deaths. It could be scary for people. But we are not going to shut society down because ultimately we are not going to be able to stop a virus anyway. And the disruption to society, the second-order disruption, is going to be worse than the virus itself. And when COVID happened, for whatever reason, the public health authorities threw all of that out the window, even as it became clear that COVID was only dangerous to very old or very sick people, okay? And hey, listen, is that a slight exaggeration? It's a slight exaggeration. But most reasonably healthy people under 65 were at very low risk from COVID.
You shouldn't, as an approach, destroy the global economy to deal with a medical issue of this nature.
That's correct. And we knew that. And we shouldn't destroy children's educations or scare them and make them more anxious and put them on screens even more than they are. COVID was not good for the mental health of, particularly of teenagers, and they are still suffering from that.
Yeah.
And so that's the first thing we have to remember. And why the public health establishment went that way, I believe, although, there's, I don't know that anyone's ever going to find the paper, the email saying this, that because Tony Fauci was concerned very early on that this had come out of a lab, he wanted control over the response, and he wanted a very aggressive response, and he hoped for a vaccine that would sort of solve this, and he hoped to be the hero and distract people from what had happened and where it had come from. Can I prove that? I cannot. I just believe it is consistent with some public evidence that we have and with the way they behave, because otherwise I don't know why they cracked the way they did. And I do think it will be, listen, if the Chinese stop playing with these viruses, hopefully we won't have another one of these for another 100 years. But if it does happen again, it will be very interesting to see if people panic again or if they are more skeptical of a shutdown.
I mean, I think that people in general are way more skeptical. That's my observation in general, large, talking to people across a broad swath of society. But I'm not convinced that a lot of the public health bureaucracy is sufficiently skeptical.
They love to be in charge. They love lockdowns. They love bird flu. They are very aggressive, and they don't seem to have learned very much. What they've learned is that, we can't let Republicans be in the government because they're not going to let us do what we want.
Listen, this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. Do you have a final thought as we finish?
I mean, I'm still sort of trying to articulate my views about drugs in a bigger way. I think it's a very culturally important moment. I think the libertarian case is easy, right? Like, it should all be like alcohol. It should all be legal. That has been a disastrous failure in practice. And so I think, like, what I'm trying to do and what I may do in a book, what I hope to do in a book, is articulate in a sort of consistent philosophical way why it is that we need to be firm about drug use, even though we're never going to prohibit alcohol again. And that's why stigma is a good thing, why drug use is not a societal neutral, and we need to tell people that. And that's what I'm hoping to do in the next few months, year or two.
Well, Alex Berenson, it's such a pleasure to have had you on.
Jan, thanks for having me.
Thank you all for joining Alex Berenson and me on this episode of American Thought Leaders. I'm your host, Jan Jekielek.